Thank you so much for joining us for this very important conversation. I looked through the participant registration list and we've got a very good representation from all over the continent. We've got people from Nigeria, Ghana, Zimbabwe, the DRC, Kenya, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Eswatini, Lesotho, Mali, Burundi, just to mention a few. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Bonolo Makgale, and I head up the Center's Democracy and Civic Engagement Unit. For those of you who don't know about the Center, we are at the University of Pretoria, an internationally recognized university-based institution. We are at the law faculty of the university. And part of our work is essentially combining academic excellence and effective activism to advance human rights, particularly in Africa. We contribute to advancing human rights through education, research, and advocacy. And I, in particular, manage the Center's work with the Pan-African Parliament, which is an African Union legislative organ. Part of the work is to close the democratic gap by creating a space for citizens and civil society to interact and influence the work of the Pan-African Parliament by contributing to its policies and chart new directions for governance on the continent. And we convened this meeting as an attempt to create a space for young Africans to engage with the Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus. 2019 stats show that 60% of Africa's population is under the age of 25. This show communicates to us that young people are both the future and the present in Africa, because 60% of them are here today on the continent, speaking, thinking, engaging, resisting oppressive regimes. Think about what young people in Nigeria did with NSARS last month. Think about what young Ugandans are currently doing. And so Pan-African Parliament as an institution and an important organ of the African Union would be poorer if it doesn't engage the 60%. Young people's voices are everywhere. If you aren't engaging them, then you are deliberately ignoring them. And I think it is important right now more than ever to have young people from across the continent talking to each other, to form a collective Pan-African voice that will find expression in formalized institutions like the Pan-African Parliament to influence policy and to support the Pan-African Parliament mandate. I mean, how many legitimate platforms and structures led by young people are fully recognized by states, are fully recognized by policymakers as important stakeholders in policy formation processes, for an example? How do the politics of young people find expression through formal mechanism of engagements with states, through formal mechanisms of engagement with regional bodies? And so before I hand over to our speakers, I want to leave you with a quote by Frantz Fanon. And he says, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, and obey it. And so I think for us as young Africans, we should continue to discover our mission in the present and imagine a future that contradicts our current reality. And as we imagine a different future that contradicts our current reality, we should work towards fulfilling our mandate as young Africans. And I think this meeting, at the heart of it, we are starting something here. We are starting a movement, like I said, a Pan-African voice for us to collectively contribute to Africa's politics and collectively contribute to Africa's development by placing ourselves within the workings of the Pan-African Parliament. And just to give us a brief background and just to help us understand what the Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus does in particular, at this point I'm going to welcome Mr. Abdoulaye Ndaw, who is the committee clerk of the Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. really sorry for my for my language. I come from Senegal, so French-speaking country. So I just started learning English here in South Africa since I spent 4 years here as a committee clerk of the Youth Caucus. The Youth Caucus of the Pan-African Parliament has been adopted in October 2012. And according to the resolution which adopt the Youth Caucus Forum, they just motivated because in 2012, more than 50% of the youth in Africa was below 35 years old. So, and meaning that the future is will be handled by youth. So the projection which were mentioning in the resolution was about by 2020 the youth population will be above 60%, and now we notice that it's above 60%. Taking into consideration this reality, African Union and the head of state and government and all international partners of African countries, they adopted the African Youth Charter in 2006 in Addis Ababa, which served as the strategic framework that give direction for youth empowerment and development at all effects. Young Africans continue to face difficulties regarding health, education, employment, and recently in West Africa, so many young people just travel to Europe by boat since it's nearby. So the main objective of the Youth Caucus, as well as the Women Caucus of the Parliament, are to just give recommendation through resolution and directive to African countries. Don't forget that the Parliament is not yet a legislative power. So what we do presently since now 6 years is to discuss about youth issues and give it back to the Parliament as recommendation and resolution. So all the MPs who came from national parliament, they just try to defend the youth through the recommendation adopted in the youth committee in the parliament. So now, since 6 years, we went to so many African countries to sensitize through mission to meet the youth, the national youth committees, and discuss about them, about the issues, the problem they are facing in their own country. And through the parliament, we held forum and symposium and some workshop. The most recent we held was in Sudan, where we convened more than 44 youth national committees, youth national council. Yeah, from now, that's what I can say about all the mission related to Youth Caucus in the Parliament. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Just as you were given the background on the workings of the Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus, I'm already seeing an entry point there for young Africans to contribute towards recommendations and resolutions that are developed and hopefully ultimately adopted by the Pan-African Parliament and the AU. Because like I said earlier, at the heart of it, we want to find the politics of young people, or rather we want to see the politics of young people find expression through formal mechanisms of engagement with regional bodies like the Pan-African Parliament. And so this is something that we can think about going forward, that how do we ensure that we as young Africans contribute effectively and constructively to the work that the Pan-African Parliament does in advancing human rights in Africa and good governance. At this point, I'm going to welcome Honorable Naledi Chirwa. Honorable Naledi is a member of the National Assembly of South Africa. She's actually one of the youngest members of Parliament that we have in our National Assembly. And in fact, Honorable Naledi is a student at the University of Pretoria. She did her undergrad at the University of Pretoria, and she's currently doing her master's in philosophy at the university. And Honorable, as the university, we are very proud to be associated with you as one of the brilliant young minds that we have in this continent. And thank you once again for availing yourself to come and give this keynote address. We're looking forward to hearing your reflections, in particular on what it looks like in your case in particular to be a young member of the National Assembly, but as well what you are imagining Africa to look like. And so over to you, Honorable Chirwa. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Program Director. I hope that the audio is okay before I continue, if I can just get a heads up.
Yes, we can hear you, Honorable.
All right, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Naledi Chirwa. I am from Mamelodi in Pretoria. I was born in Johannesburg, and I currently still live in Pretoria, and I frequent Cape Town and other constituency places that I'm deployed in by my organization, the Economic Freedom Fighters. Firstly, I'd like to thank you so much for this engagement in particular that it is happening. It is long overdue, and I think it is upon us as young people to mainstream these kinds of conversations because nobody will give us an Africa that we want. It is absolutely and completely in our hands. Nobody will recommend a better Africa for us outside of what we deem to be a better Africa for us. So shout out to the leadership of the Youth Caucus in the Pan-African Parliament for making these strides. We are hoping for more. We are hoping for the mainstreaming of the conversations that happen in the caucus. We are hoping for the mainstreaming of the engagements of young people across the continent. And all resources should be exploited in this regard to ensure that this happens. There's many nuances and dynamics in really distinctly describing what we want to see happening in Africa in terms of our state of being and addressing historical injustices, which are pretty much explicitly still very much present in the continent. I know I speak on behalf of many countries when I say that although we have overcome colonialism on paper, our realities as young Black people, as young Black women, as young queer people, as the LGBTIQ community, as disabled women in rural areas and townships, there's many aspects of our living and state of being that have not been addressed adequately by the leadership across the continent, which is a dire failure if we are being honest and not being, if we are not being, I don't know how to do, but like superficial with the truth. Firstly, we have to establish across the borders, which are imaginary, that the unity of Africans is for the benefit of Africans. The unity of Africa is for the benefit of Africans. A close friend of mine, Tabu Shingang, who's a lecturer at the University of Pretoria, uses this analogy in his classroom. So he puts everybody together in the classroom and just separates them. Okay, you three go there, you two go there, you three go there. And says, from now onwards, you cannot engage with one another unless you have a certain paper which you have to apply for in 6 months in advance. You cannot engage with one another unless this and this happens. And that's precisely what colonialism did to Africans. It took away our means and states and modes of being and existing and coexisting as Africans. And that is why primarily we should reject borders as a principle, because firstly, they were not for our benefit. And secondly, they were not for the upliftment of Africa, but the upliftment of colonizers and settlers in the West. And the systemic operations that were infringed, or rather imposed, in the African governance system work towards ensuring that that remains the same. And that is why we are in the situation that we are in, where we need so many processes for simple conversations to happen among Africans of what they deem to be the future of Africa. So many processes have to be followed just for an engagement to be had. We have to follow so many processes. And another thing, we have not had enough conversation as young people amongst ourselves of what we view to be our aspirations of what leadership should look like, especially in our founding movements that we all exist in, politically, non-politically, non-government organizations in the countries that we live in communities that we live in. We are bombarded by the ego of white supremacist culture that exaggerates itself, and that we have inherited, sadly, even as Africans, because white supremacist culture only survives by exaggerating itself. This happens through different systems that we are functioning in. An example is the education system. You look at the primary sources of the modules that we study. Those are Western white men, who most of which have died, and that is how they sustain the culture of white supremacy in institutions of higher learning. And those are things that we should also be looking into in terms of imagining the kind of leadership we want to crop out, or to imagine the kind of leadership we want to see emanating and building from then onwards. We obviously have an issue of corruption across the continent. We have an issue of inadequate representation of Black women, of queer people, the LGBTIQ community, of disabled women living in rural areas. The system works in such a way that the very groups that need to be most represented are ostracized, are isolated, and are left out on the outskirts of governance and the conversations on policy making. And now we are depending on a particular group of men, both white men and Black men, to make decisions of how Black women should continue in a community or should survive in communities. So obviously what we aspire to in terms of leadership should be inclusive of what we term representative aesthetics, and not just on an aesthetic level, really, because my internet connection is unstable. I don't know if I'm still audible, but making space for representative politics actually builds towards ensuring that the politics of those groups that are being represented should be adhered to. There is no white man who is going to speak on behalf of a Thokozani in Alexandra who can't go to university because agana mali yokudla or agana transport, or even if they get a bursary, has to go through processes of accommodation in a different province, and all of those nuances that come up with wanting to have a better life for someone else. And also another thing is the issue of loyalty and allegiance to political parties, and not the project of ensuring that socialism is ushered, of ensuring that economic liberty is ushered. Our political allegiance should not be a thing that we speak about amongst the youth. What we should be speaking about is the capacity to lead, the policies that are being presented to lead the countries, and more than anything, the result base of leadership in governance that emanates from leadership being chosen by young people at that. So at some point, we also have to having those conversations of what our allegiance and loyalties to liberation movements across Africa mean for us as a people, mean for us as young people, mean for us in our quest to fulfill our objective as young people in Africa. And there's also the issue of cultural aspirations that we haven't really garnered enough strength, or not even strength really, because these are conversations that are happening across the continent. It's just that they are not mainstreamed. And I'll give an example. The issue of Afrofeminism or overthrowing patriarchy is conversations, or are conversations that are happening in rural areas, led by women who are living in rural areas, led by women who are disabled, led by women who are living with HIV, led by women who are poor in our communities and townships, right? But our political culture, our governance culture does not embody and reflect these aspirations on the ground. And I think my biggest call to the Youth Caucus of the Pan-African Parliament is that a lot more groundwork needs to be done. It is not enough to just engage on these platforms. It is very important to do engagements on a ground-based level, to become ground-based movements and leaders that go to the ground and engage with the people and become one with the people. That is why it is also important to not leave communities when we are sent to positions of power, because those are the communities we owe accountability and responsibility as young people. And that example we get from our heroine, Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, who stayed in Soweto despite her political growth, despite her political expediency, and throughout her old challenges, she remained in Soweto as a community member, as somebody who they engage with, as somebody they see Mabaya as Paza to go get bread down the street. It looks like an aesthetic exercise, but what it does really is to ground young leaders in the politics of the community and not extradite us from what happens in our communities, not to romanticize township life or the underdevelopment in rural areas. That's a completely different issue, because I know we all agree that it is an injustice that majority of Black people are squashed up in informal settlements, are squashed up in townships, and do not even have enough land, even in rural areas. So those are the cultural aspirations we should be drawing ourselves closer to ensure that those measurements are being imposed by young people, because there is no time to engage further. Young people are suffocated in Africa, are suffocated in every sense. We are dying each and every day, not because there is not a chance to live, but because it is expensive to live in a capitalist Africa that is anti-Black and that even thrives on xenophobic and Afrophobic aspirations and modes of existence. Another thing, you know, because culture is an evolving thing. And I always say that there's two aspects of culture that are preserved when we talk about culture in the traditional sense and indigenous sense. The other forms of culture we are able to evolve from. Like, for example, in my community, I remember growing up, when there's a funeral at home, they would cover the mirrors, or they would turn off the TVs and the radios. And then I would ask my grandmother, what did you guys cover before mirrors? And what did you guys switch off before radios? And I think that is proof enough that culture is something that is able to evolve, unless it has to do with the liberty of women, unless it has to do with the liberty of children, then culture is preserved. And that is something we must confront very overtly as young people, because if you leave a certain group of people behind, you are staying behind yourself, because we are a unit. There is no thriving of Africa with just Black men at the center. There is no thriving of Africa with just white women at the center who are pointing out and placing out our liberation aspirations. There is no liberty if certain groups that are most marginalized in our communities stay behind and do not lead the conversation. Fanon says the first shall be the last and the last shall be the first. And that should be the case even in conversations, in policy making, in our means to ensure that things happen for the means of justifying and ensuring that economic freedom happens in our lifetime. I don't have enough time, so I'll go on to the issue of gender-based violence. Because that is a very, very topical issue and a big issue in Africa, because we sadly inherited a white supremacist culture of patriarchy, in the sense of men being at the center of existence, men being at the center of benefits. I'm not sure if my audio is still loud because I'm hearing a sound.
Yeah, okay, ma'am. We can
It's
hear
still
you.
okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. And this is also historical across the globe, and it's not an issue that is peculiar to Africa per se. That is how white supremacist culture entrenched itself beyond current existence, or beyond the issue of removing colonial power from our parliaments, or beyond removing certain apartheid laws and keeping some of them. The issue of patriarchy is much more deeper than we want to see it, because it is the reason why today black on black violence is not only gendered, but it is the source of our inability to communicate and engage as young people. Our issue in Africa is men, just to be clear. Our issue in Africa is men who have personalized the privilege that white supremacy has given them through patriarchy, through hypermasculinity, through our aspirations to be the alpha white male. Our issue in Africa is patriarchy, and that is men. The obsession of men who are emasculated, black men who are emasculated to embody and perform white masculinity, is the reason where we are today in terms of gender-based violence. To harm a black woman should be seen in the context of black consciousness of black on black violence. Because when we speak of black on black violence, we often eradicate the issue of gender-based violence, and it falls right in there, because black women, black gays, black children, and black men are also black people. When you speak of black on black violence, you speak of the entire amalgamation of violence within the black community, and should not be exclusive within and of self of tribalism, of Afrophobia and xenophobia, but should be inclusive of gender-based violence. And even in our history of Pan-African discourse, it has existed in the sense of erasure, in the sense of isolation of black women within the struggle of Pan-Africanism. And we see that a lot. I remember when Prof. Lumumba was giving a lecture through the EFF coronavirus pandemic lecture, EFF book festival thing. He gave us a very detailed history of Pan-Africanism, but only mentioned one woman in that history and the context, and that was Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. And I had intended to write a response to him, but other things took priority. And these are some of the responses that I was going to send out to Prof. Lumumba. It shouldn't take intensive research to learn of the Nigerian woman who protested against the colonial tax in 1929, or to know of the efforts of women like Funmilayo Ransome Kuti, who organized and mobilized for Pan-African movements in the 1940s. Amy Garvey, who on some occasions is said to have been preferred by the audience as a keynote speaker over her husband Marvin Garvey, is still an uncelebrated Pan-Africanist heroine. Miriam Makeba, who spearheaded the gift and the duty of conscientizing Africans across the continent through her gracious and revolutionary gift of art. Wangari Maathai, whom among some of the work she has done, highlighted the importance of centralizing the struggles of women living in rural areas. Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba, who successfully held off the establishment of Portuguese control in Angola for over 30 years. An accurate account of the history of Pan-Africanism should include the names of Bibi Titi Mohammed, Gambo Sawaba, Charlotte Maxeke, Albertina Sisulu, and numerous other women who have fallen in between the cracks instilled by imperialist patriarchal culture. It should instinctively be the norm to name women like Titina Sila when we acknowledge heroes like Amilcar Cabral, or Winnie Madikizela Mandela when we acknowledge Nelson Mandela for our hard-earned political freedom in South Africa in particular. African women's contribution to the struggle was never an aesthetic posture, nor were they an accessory in fighting colonialism. This is a vital aspect when names of powerful women activists and Pan-Africanists come to the fore. They are reduced to mere black and white imageries of black women with a fist in the air with no adequate documentation or telling of their contributions in detail, in biographies, in mainstream education, in mainstream politics and governance. The Maputo Protocol, which is lauded globally for being a legal resource, and which Prof. Lumumba also made mention of on the day, outlines women's struggles and what is to be done in response to correct these injustices entrenched by colonialism. These are injustices and systems made to sustain a hierarchy that places women, especially the girl children, at the bottom of human dignity in every sense. And sadly, many of these catastrophic consequences are now perpetuated by so-called liberation movements, who are now in governance across the continent. Much work in African countries by Pan-African feminists from Uganda to Sudan was maintained to never divorce the gender struggle from Pan-Africanism. Even when regurgitations of division were used to silence women's movements and organizing. The Maputo Protocol in itself is testament of the persistence of Pan-African women in not only organizing, but to solidify African feminism in this revolutionary ideology of Pan-Africanism. It is therefore upon us to be unapologetic in demanding an intersectional and feminist documentation of Pan-Africanism consistently. An African unity that we aspire to cannot be exclusive or blind to the uniqueness of the suffering of African women who to date are still not being protected from HIV infection as per the recommendation of the lauded Maputo Protocol and having to cross mountains for property rights. There is no African unity that can be forged with homophobic African countries that subject Africans and gay Africans who are also Africans to brutality entrenched by white supremacy to sustain a hierarchy and domination over Africans because of sexuality and gender performativity. There is no unity in silence. While Palestine is not yet free from the reigns, brutal policies and violence at the hands of Israel, GDP growth in 2-3 African countries will never mean victory for the whole of Africa, so long as rape is still a tool of destruction in the Democratic Republic of Congo. In every country and across the globe, the unity of Africans and African women as laborers and victims of the failure to industrialize domestic work, as immigrants and sex workers, as the least represented constituency in African parliaments, thus becomes an onus on all of us to cement Pan-Africanism in its true sense and reverence for the emancipation of women as a pivotal point in our quest for a united Africa. And with those words, I would like to depart from this engagement. I truly thank the organizers for ensuring that this happens, and I hope this is not the last. We have an issue and many issues as Africa that we need to resolve, ranging from white supremacy, which still exists, even in the absence of white people, to patriarchy, to racism, to capitalism. We need to usher an Afro-feminist socialist regimes in all the African countries. And that cannot happen in isolation of one African country to another. And that is why the division, the borders were entrenched, because there is power in the unity of Africa. It is so sad to see xenophobic utterances being made against the assertions of open borders, because opening borders is actually of benefit to all Africans in terms of employment, in terms of culture, in terms of traveling, in every sense really of expanding and growing the African continent. And much research has even been done and documented on this part. But xenophobia does not follow rules. Xenophobia does not consult with the research. Xenophobia was not created to better Africans, but to really separate us. And I think as the Youth Caucus of the Pan-African Parliament, you have a very big task in your hands, because young people on the ground do not know you, sadly. They do not know the work you do. And you have to do much more on the ground in all these countries to ensure that the voice of African youth is one. Because we are inheriting this Africa that is debilitated, that is catastrophic because of colonizer settlers, and as of recent, because of liberation movements as well, which we should rid ourselves of as Africans. And that is the conversation that I would like us to have going on forth. And very much thank you. And I'm truly humbled for this engagement. And thank you very much, Program Director. You can take over from here.
Thank you very much, Honorable Chirwa. My name is Pamanda Mhlongo, working for the Democracy Development Program and partnering with the Center for Human Rights for this specific engagement in engaging with the PAP Youth Caucus. Honorable Chirwa, we thank you very much for your inputs. I think as you started talking specifically about sort of our obsession with borders, and especially how it undermines the meaningful cohesion of Africa as a continent, is something that we need to continue to speak more about in various fora. And we really enjoyed your presentation, specifically as you also spoke to how we as young people ourselves haven't started having the very important conversation around what we ought to aspire to, relating to our values, as well as our what we think our leadership should actually look like as a young people. When we look at the statistics in Africa, and we actually look at the political trends when it comes to who is in office, who's occupying certain positions, there's a disjuncture there, and it doesn't make sense, because surely we should feel more represented by seeing some of us who are similarly young in those spaces as well. When you spoke also about partisanship, the way in which our political party affiliation sometimes undermines our collective struggle as young people, especially when we think about when our partisanship as it relates to movements and organizations with an aversion to growth and change. Organizations themselves who are unwilling to rethink and re-strategize the way in which they engage with young people and the rest of their constituencies. When you spoke about specifically also around representation of young people, not only in terms of their youth, but in terms of the representation of sexual, ethnic, and differently abled persons, we understand that this is a starting point for our conversation with the Pan-African Youth Parliament. And so we note that there are a couple of things that we omitted in terms of this process, but we thought it's important to start a conversation. When you think about the fact that a large part of Africa, for instance, is Francophone, there are Swahili-speaking individuals that are not adequately represented in the space where we convene in this manner of dialogue. But it's important to at least start the conversation, and hopefully within the next year or so, we'll be able to input those types of instances. But further, the idea of sign language interpretation and things like that, that representation isn't just something that we talk about, that we meaningfully engage in that practice. Of course, you ended off your discussion around the aspects of gender-based violence and the violence of patriarchy in the way that it contributes to the erasure of women's struggles and our heroines across the continent. There's a lot to be said still about the nature in which women's and the liberation struggle in Africa itself has gone down, and how post-liberation, there's a lot of erasure that continues to happen in the various spaces. Honorable Chirwa, I was just wondering if you would do us the honor of giving us maybe another 5 more minutes of your time, in case there are individuals who would like to address questions directly to you. Okay. So as we understand, our colleague, Honorable Naledi Chirwa, does have a number of obligations that she has to engage in today, but I think it was important to start us off in that aspect. But also, when we start thinking about our engagement with the Pan-African Parliament, we also have to start thinking, sure, there's a youth caucus, but how do various young people across the continent start to input into the youth caucus in a meaningful way, so that when our participation as young people is noted across the continent, we actually start to engage directly with the representatives within that youth caucus itself. So for the next portion, or the next segment of our discussion today, we have 4 panelists that we'd like to engage directly. Should you have any questions, any thoughts, any inputs around the different comments that the panelists themselves might be engaging with, please make sure to use our chat option. Once the panel discussion itself is over, we'll also be able to ask you to raise your hands so that you can make a direct input into the space using your mic. As you do engage, if an opportunity arises where we do pick you out from the people who have raised their hands, please ensure that you are in a space where the sound itself, there's no background noise, or the background noise is as limited as possible, so that we can have a good sort of engagement, that it isn't undermined by that level of interference when it comes to the noise. So I'd like to introduce our 4 panelists for this session. And here, these are young people from various sort of spaces within the continent. Firstly, I just want to pass our condolences to one of our panelists, Lucanio, from the Thabo Mbeki Foundation. Unfortunately, there's been a passing in his family, and we wish the family all the strength as they go ahead at the preparations for anything that they might be preparing for, and we hope that they are consolidated by the fact that we are thinking of them and we have them in our hearts and minds. But of course, our 4 panelists that we have for this engagement, we have Kelebogile Dikatso Sepoti, who is an entrepreneurial leadership coach and consultant. Her focus for this specific aspect of our program will be looking at trade mobility and the role that young people can play in ensuring that there's some sort of economic trends that are moving across the continent for the purposes of young people. We have Aderonke Ige, my apologies for that pronunciation, Nigerian human rights lawyer, who's also a social justice crusader, and will be giving us sort of her perspectives on the ways in which Pan-African Parliament can engage in a more legalistic perspective, specifically as it relates to the trends that she's been witnessing at home in Nigeria, but also looking at what the sort of West African trends look like. We have with us also Perminis Moinogu, who is a researcher of Kenyan origin, but is based in South Africa for his education and work. And he'll be letting us know from his perspective what the general trends are insofar as youth political participation within the Kenyan environment, as well as just a general Eastern perspective, East Africa perspective. We also have with us Ngubeko Maseko, who is a BA Law and History grad. She's currently pursuing her LLB at the University of Pretoria, and she'll be exploring the role of youth in ensuring that Africa reaches its goal of the African Union Agenda 2063 in a manner that is more healthily inclusive of young people. So we'll start off with Ms. Kelebogile, and then we'll go to Ade, and then we'll have Perminis, and then we'll have Ngubeko. I'd like to give you each maybe a starting point of about 5 minutes to just let us know what your initial feelings and responses as it relates to your point of view would be for this specific subject matter. Kelebogile?
Much, Spamanda, and I must also just extend a note of gratitude to the organizing team for this, because I think conversations like these are really long overdue, and it's time that young people really do get involved and really do get, engaged in the topics that really do affect us. So having looked at the topic and just this platform that we're at today, there were quite a number of things that came to mind in terms of saying where can the youth get involved, as well as just make tangible impact that we really need to see in society. And the one that really came to mind was around the issue around intergenerational leadership. I think a lot of the times, especially on our continent, we see quite a number of older and senior people holding, positions of power, and not just in the sense of government or political affiliations, but also in spaces of corporate and what we deem as high and responsible entrepreneurship that, we see in this day and age. And I think a lot of corporates have seen that there is a need to have younger voices in the way that they actually package their products, send it out into the market, as well as distribute the products and the services that they've got. And one such example is having things such as the millennial boards that Unilever and Deloitte are actually looking into right now, just to make sure that, all beings of community, especially the youth, have representation in terms of how businesses are governed, and what kind of products we want to see, aligned with a lot of the values that we really just want to speak to and really want to see, what we want to wear, what we want to eat, where we want to be seen, and so forth. So that element is a very important one. And I think it's one that we can start mobilizing and moving into spaces such as the Pan-African Parliament, where we are engaging in this manner. But I'm hoping that the topics that we do speak to today can then be taken and form tangible action steps and plans that we can actually implement on. The second part was just around trade. And I know we've been speaking quite a lot about the African continental free trade area. And it's an important one because I think Honorable Naledi had touched on it, to open borders. A lot of the times we speak about it in the context of just having goods and services that are being traded, but you can't speak about trading goods and services without speaking about people. And people need to be at the forefront of these products and services in order for them to move from one space to another. How do we then, offer ourselves enough room to explore different opportunities that exist in order for us to trade with one another? An example that I'd like to give is an example by one of my friends, Ulunga Dlamini from the Kingdom of Eswatini. And he spoke about how he traveled to go to Ethiopia the one time and realized that they've got really good coffee, and he'd like to, import a bit of it into his own home country in Swaziland. And for me, it clicked to say, yes, this is what we want to see, that level of exposure that takes place, number one, to say that once you start moving around, you're able then to realize the gaps and the opportunities that do exist in some of our home countries, and able to then trade for the goods and the services that we need in a country that the products and the services are really needed. So we can't really speak about trade without speaking about people, and people being able to move from one area into another in a seamless manner. One other important area that I think we often leave out whenever we speak about trade, especially in the context of entrepreneurship, we often have it centered around urban areas. We often have the conversation centered around township economies, but very seldom do we have it centered around rural communities and what it means in rural communities for trade to take place. And please don't get me wrong, this is not about sitting in a position of privilege and being able to disseminate some kind of information for those communities to be able to use the knowledge and be able to better themselves, because that knowledge has already existed. There's something innate about the space of entrepreneurship that I believe that we all need to look into and really appreciate since Kingdom Come. When we speak about things like innovation, for example, things such as innovation have long existed in rural communities. It makes sense that during the times when somebody was or was trying to hunt down a deer and so forth, they had the knowledge and intuition to be able to put water in a shell, put it underground in order for it to cool down. That for me is innate knowledge that we had back then, and understanding that once you do then get the crops that you were looking for, get the deer that you were trying to hunt down and so forth, you're able to then start bartering and selling. So those principles of entrepreneurship have always been there. We just don't have the right language in this day and age to be able to share it amongst one another. And when we speak about trading intercontinentally, what do we actually mean? Because it's existed back then, trading amongst each other, trading with other rural communities. But now how do we take the language that we use on platforms such as this and make sure that there's full representation from across the board, and we're making sure that people are included in conversations such as this, but more importantly are able to participate as well as we're moving forward. So, and I think I've touched on the trade element as well as the mobility part of things. And I think we've seen just how even when we are trading and when you're importing certain goods or even exporting certain goods, a lot of the times you will find your goods stuck in customs. And when we do then speak about trading with one another, how do we look into areas such as that and make sure that we have full visibility and transparency of information? I'd like to know, sitting right here, if I had to sell a pen to a different country, what would the tax implications be for somebody like me? Where do I actually get that information just on one platform to be able to see it, and so that I can start engaging and participating in this economy? And when we speak about this free trade area agreement, we also just realize the opportunity that there is. There's 1.2 billion people on this continent that can trade with one another. And the GDP that comes out of this is about $3.4 trillion that is, projected and that we can really tap into. So conversations like this are important, and I'm looking forward for us to really engage, because once we have ourselves economically emancipated, we are able to contribute in other sectors. We are able to direct the kind of conversations, the kind of causes and movement we want to see in society, policy, just so that there's good impact for the minority groups that we often just overlook, and so that we can have good movement in the issues and the values and the elements in society that are really important to us. Thank you, Spamandla.
Thank you very much, Kalebo. I'd now like to hand over to Ade, who will take us through her initial thoughts on our topic of discussion. Ade, okay?
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here with everyone else. There's really no time, but I'm glad we are starting off this, what I believe is going to be a massive, a huge series of conversations, around issues that matter to us as young people, not just young people, but young Africans. So we have something binding us. So no matter how short this is, it's going to just be a catalyst for other conversations or subsequent discussions. So I would love to speak just still in context, but you would hear me making a lot of inferences to the movement that has been birthed in Nigeria specifically, and that's the EndSARS movement. So, but before I get there, I want to also let us know that, look, no matter how much we want to dialogue, if we don't realize this primary thing, which is the fact that we need to, first of all, love and embrace ourselves as Africans first, we can't move forward. So there are realities that are confronting us as a people. We have very peculiar and similar realities as young Africans. But then, we have a lot of factors or even persons, systems that have been built just to repress and oppress us, such that when we begin to move in that understanding, in that consciousness of our oneness, of the unity, of the strength of our voices as a one, then they begin to throw several things in our ways, just make us lose focus and so on. Unfortunately, I've heard a lot of talk about, white supremacy and everything, which really is a huge problem, and it has always been. But one of the things that we're now confronting, which is another monster, is the fact that even at home, within ourselves, we have found some of our leaders, especially in this patriarchal society and in this society that is so ageistic, they have come to bring a brick wall to let us feel like young people, there's just a little you can do, and you have to learn, you have to watch, you have to sit back and relax and just watch, which is a big lie, which is a fallacy, So it's now a repetition. We are finding some of our leaders becoming the exact thing that we have been fighting against for years. So our leaders at home are also becoming these supremacists. And then it's now no longer about race, it's about the oppression of age. And that's what we have seen play out in Nigeria, in Algeria, in Uganda, in Congo, in a lot of our countries in very recent times. So I'll just start on this premise that in Nigeria, for instance, I know about several other African countries. Now, let me tell you one of the things they used to cheat us, and it has been going on for years. The fact that we have ministerial positions. And I can tell you categorically, as I sit here and speak, in Nigeria, the person that represents the Ministry of Youth and Culture is a 53-year-old man. His predecessor was a 56-year-old man. Does that mean that we have a dearth of young people in Nigeria, or we have people that can't manage this position? So all of these are lies and concoctions, and that was what we saw play out. So in Nigeria in recent times, as with a lot of several African countries, young people decided to take a position after years of oppression, after years of feeling like they don't belong, like, okay, we are not part of the decision-making caucus. And then they became more focused on just pursuing their lives and ensuring that they exist in spite of the system and the challenges. So that's what they've been focusing on. So you find young people in innovation, in creativity, in the entertainment industry, just making things happen and, just blowing up the GDP and everything. But then we have been shortchanged for so long in the political structure. So in economy, you find us there, in the social system, you find us there. But when it comes to the real politics of governance, you find young people suddenly missing. And is it because they want to miss? No, but because the system has been concocted on a lie which talks at you, a lie which makes you believe that as a young person, you just have to sit and watch and learn what exactly are you learning? Because really, when you look at the continent as a whole, you find that there are hardly even best practices. There are hardly examples that you can key into and say, oh, we are actually learning. So, and for most of these people who have become old, who have become institutions on their own, who feel that without them nothing can work, you find out that they also started when they were quite young. But unfortunately, they have held on to power in such a way that they don't want you and I there. And it has become a class of oppressors versus us, who ordinarily are supposed to also be included in the scheme of things. So now here is my main message. My main message is we are not waiting to be handed power. We are not waiting to be granted seats, in this space. What are we doing? We are taking these spaces. Now, let me tell you, the background to NSAS movement, for instance, it has been about police brutality. Though we know that it's beyond that, it's a bigger system. But the one that began to confront us immediately, that led to the outcry, it started years back, like 2017. There's this special arm of the police called the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, which immediately became a monster squad, a killer squad. And who were they targeting? They were also profiling young people. The target was the young person. So, for instance, the way I look, I can easily be profiled like, okay, you're so young, but why are you looking like you have, let's say you are living well. Let's say you are even somebody who has been able to, in spite of all the challenges thrown your way, has been able to make a way for yourself still and to still live well. The police begins to target you, and very shortly your life is a die. So it's a thing of either you live or you keep fighting for your life until you eventually die. So that led to the outcry and the massive movement that you saw starting with NSAS. So what happened? As usual, we were underestimated. It was a thing of, okay, the young people, they'll just soon get tired or they'll run out of resources and so on. But, because we meant business. And this is to tell you again that when we mean business, when we come together with a common agenda, when we have sincerity of purpose and the commonness, the community that comes from fighting together for ourselves, we can sustain things. So by the time the protest started, day 1, day 2, day 3, and it went on for like a week. And then we were not just getting resources from outside, we were mobilizing resources and being one another's keepers. It dawned on the government, which is a government that is held down by old people. It dawned on them that, look, these young people are not here to play. It looks like they mean business and they are going to take us down. And that was the point that oppression, once again, tyranny was introduced, and then they used violence and so on. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of how it played out in Nigeria, unfortunately. And this is to tell you that if we allow our old leaders to keep oppressing us using the same system that we are helping to build against us, then we won't move forward. So we have to be very deliberate about what we are doing. So are we stopping there? Because it looks like, the protests have been truncated. But guess what happened? A movement has just been birthed. So it's beyond protest. It's now the fact that we have come together beyond the process to say, look, we are going to continue this movement. We are going to have these conversations and we are going to evolve. It's no longer about surviving economically. Yes, there's so much we can do, but it's time to also be politically active. So it's beyond being an aspirant or a candidate of a party, though that is also inclusive in the matter. But then it's about giving political awareness, political education, sensitization, going to the grassroots and helping to create this massive orientation within the minds of the people that have been held down for so long by the same oppressive regime that cuts across Africa. So how are we going to do that? I see one immediate missing gap. Remember how, I will be rounding off now because I think my time is really short, that is left. So remember how when you want to deprive a man of what is most essential to him in life, one of the tools that are usually used is to deprive him of his identity. And now we as Africans, we have a lot uniting us. But something as common as even language is already dividing us. So depending on who colonized you, you find yourself either speaking English or speaking French and so on. I know years back in history, there was a time that Africa tried to mobilize to have a common language. But I think we're back to that point now. I don't know. I know it's doable. It looks massive. It looks like something that is probably unconquerable, but I know we can do it. So maybe that conversation is also another thing we should be visiting right now. Number one, creating legal frameworks for our leaders who are really misbehaving and oppressing and suppressing the young people to be brought to justice, to be, brought to book. And that's one of the things that we are already doing in Nigeria. And we feel that every other country should key into it, and then to start to revisit the issue of identity based on language. How do we come together to make sure that we are speaking the same language, which will further foster our unity, not just as Africans, but also as young Africans. So I'll pause it for now here so that the conversation can continue. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ade. We really appreciate your input and would like to move on to Perminis for now. Just as a reminder, we are engaged currently in a panel discussion. We really do welcome your input in the chat section and any questions that you may have for any of the speakers or all of the speakers that we'll address after they have spoken or given their initial input. Yes, Perminis.
Thank you very much, Spamandla, and thank you everyone else that played a role in making this happen. Very much thankful and grateful. Yeah, I've read some of the chats and the comments that have been coming out by various people who are participants, and some of them are saying some very interesting things, such as the youth cannot disrespect the older generation by making noises. They must first create a process where there is inclusion. We cannot make decisions in the absence of the older people. Well, I think this has always been the challenge, where culture and politics are seemingly being used to silence the youth. Well, in the case of Kenya, we have a very recent issue whereby the ruling party has been making moves to overhaul the constitution, but they're doing this while bringing in the opposition party, the main opposition party, so that they can call it a Building Bridges Initiative. It's called the BBI, Building Bridges Initiative, whereby the ruling party, now that we're coming closer to the election period, the sitting president will not be voted out. In fact, he will carry on his work into the next constitution, where if this new constitution is passed, of which it will be, if the youth continue sleeping, and his leadership will continue, and he will also create leadership positions for the opposition leaders to silence them, so that the rule, the norm can continue. This is what we call the status quo, where decisions are made and in the absence of the youth, of course. Well, we've seen this happening various times before. We've had our second president, Daniel Moi, who ruled for a period of 24 years. He kept changing the constitution so that he can continue sitting on. So currently we have a very young and vibrant leader called Uhuru Kenyatta. At first we didn't see this coming, but now at the moment we're questioning ourselves, because now we used to ask ourselves, when time, according to the current constitution, a leader is only supposed to lead in 2 terms. After the current constitution is over, after his current leadership is over, he needs to sit down and let somebody else step in through an electoral process, of course. But now the problem is that is not being allowed. The only trick they're using is to go through the channel of the constitution, overhaul the whole constitution, or some very critical part of of the constitution that will allow them to create a government of national unity between the ruling party and the main opposition leaders, the main opposition party. Well, you see, the problem with such issues is the youth are always lost. The youth are always lost. They're always lost because of their political affiliations. They're always lost because they get so emotional during the electoral process that they forget that once the political process and elections is over, they're the ones who are going to be feeling it very hard on the ground. Yeah. So the youth in Kenya found themselves caught up in a political quagmire that only serves the interests of the status quo. Although the political representation shows signs of improvement due to the increase of young politicians in parliament, the majority of the youth in the grassroots do not seem to share the same sentiments, because the need for a more developmental form of politics is being seen by the youthful political leaders that they elected to represent them. No wonder the politicians believe that culture drives politics. These are the older types of politicians that believe culture drives politics, but politics do not drive culture. Older politicians wish to remain in the positions and continue influencing policy and interests and the self-interest of the status quo, while the East African region suffers a lot of strongman politics, which according to the America's former President Obama, Africa is in need of strong institutions, not strongman politics. This relates to the African culture that has been there even before our forefathers and will continue even after we're dead and gone. No matter how much the fourth industrial revolution will try to harness the opportunity for the youth not to be left out. The fact that the African continent is the youngest in the world, with the youth under 25 accounting for 60% of the total population, particularly looking at the trends in terms of reforms that are necessary to empower youth participation in politics and policy. Their success is determined by political will of the youth, and also putting a point forward that the fourth industrial revolution is beckoning us, and no youthful country or region should be left behind by technology. The need to implement fresh policies that attract more youth to enter decision-making positions in politics and business is paramount for a strong and stable Africa that is updated by technological advancement. We have artificial intelligence, right? We hear it in international news. What is Africa doing about it? Where are the African youth when it comes to artificial intelligence? These are the questions we need to be asking ourselves. Yes, we need to be involved in policy making and important decision-making positions and political decisions as well. We need to be involved in politics. But now, what about technology? What are the youth? Where are the youth when it comes to combating gender-based violence? Where are the youth when it comes to excuse me. Where are the youth when it comes to combating climate change? Where are the youth when it comes to combating unemployment, poverty? Well, these are the very things that I feel the youth should start thinking about and start getting themselves involved in. We have entrepreneurial self-empowerment projects where the youth can get involved in agriculture, for instance. Africa is known to be a consumerist continent. We need the youth to start producing, to get involved in farming projects, so that they can start producing what we eat. We don't want to keep importing food. We got land, we got arable land, we got 60% of arable land of the world. We got a chance to to do farming right here in Africa so that we can feed ourselves and also have surplus to trade with it. So I think right here in Africa, we've got so many opportunities. We've got so many things that we can do with it. And then we got educational systems that need to be upgraded. We need to upgrade our educational system so that they can start producing engineers that can become useful in our continent. We need to upgrade our education systems so that we can produce, we can produce quality graduates that are useful in our own industries, in order for us to start producing things for our own consumption and for the and the surplus of trading in other countries. Yes, I think that's all I wish to say. Yes, Pamandla, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Feminist, and thank you to the speakers before you. We'd like to go to Ngubego for her thoughts, initial thoughts as it pertains to this discussion. Ngubego will be engaging us on the role of young people in ensuring that Africa reaches its goal of Agenda 2063. Ngubego?
Right, I just needed to quickly unmute my mic. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is healthy, considering that it's almost the end of the year and year-end burnout is a real thing. I hope you guys are taking care of yourselves. And yeah, going straight into it. My sentiments with regarding today's conversation, I really believe that the involvement of young people, the youth, in leadership, not just on the sidelines, in leadership is a solution, maybe not the only solution, but is a solution that could allow for possibility of other solutions in hopes of achieving Agenda 2063. I just jotted down a few things of the reasons why I believe so. Firstly, I really believe that young people bring change. As my colleague has said, looking at Nigeria and the NSARS movement, young people have realized we don't like internal conflict. We don't like feeling conflicted. We could probably attribute this to the fact that we have now access to other places around the world where we see that people are living freely and are themselves. Struggles of each country vary, but you can see that, for example, matters of the LGBTQIA+ community are not the same in different countries. But because of social media, because of representation that we see through social media, young people can then vouch for themselves, and it validates and it affirms who they are, that this is not a default setting that you're born with. This is truly who you are. I don't think the issues that we have now are new. I think they've been there, but the only difference is now young people cannot handle internal conflict. And when they are conflicted and they are suppressed and their opinions are suppressed, as the host has said, that young people always have an opinion, and it not being heard is being intentionally, it's done so intentionally. And because of that, we see certain things such as social media movements or just general social movements. In South Africa and Namibia, we've seen the outbreak that has come out of gender-based violence, with people speaking up, taking to the streets, fighting for their rights. We've seen in South Africa as well, the movement of fees must fall, roads must fall. And although these have been proven to be effective, they usually come with consequences. And these consequences usually sometimes result in blood being shed, which is something that should not be happening. It's effective, but we cannot afford to lose lives for things that are essential for the survival of people, resources that people should be getting. For example, fees must fall. We still have Comrade Kanya Takeshe, who's still in jail, who's still fighting for his bail. One can only imagine that maybe he was the source of hope for his family, but because he fought for something he believed in, that was stripped off of him, not because he didn't qualify or whatever, but because he fought for something, free education, that should be given to all South Africans. We also then see, let me just go to my points. I wrote quite a few stuff. And like I said, we have been able to shape things and we have been able to move movements. So therefore, I believe we are capable. If not, we can be further capacitated and capable of being in leadership positions, of being part of drafting policies, and not just being in initiatives, talks, MUN stimulations. You know, I was part of something on campus at the University of Pretoria called UNASA, where we would host annual model United Nations caucuses with the Security Council and all those. And the ideas and the resolutions that would come from young minds. I think last year, the youngest participant was, if I'm not mistaken, 17. He is from Crawford College and he was a participant. But the young minds are able to come up with great initiatives. And for those reasons, we should be put in these spaces and not also do things for free. You know, we should be allowed to go into things outside of volunteering, you know, and be offered jobs and earn, you know, be able to earn as well as a minister who's 67, you know, and be colleagues, because at the same time, young people bring the knowledge they have, their initiatives, their ideas, which are essentially money. Your ideas are money. And quite evidently, a lot of young people, as I've said with Comrade Kanya Gqegeshe, are hope for their families. A lot of people, I was surprised when I came to uni, a lot of people are first generation graduates. And by employing young people because of these ideas they bring forward, who's to say what can change? What can it do to the economic dispensation in our continent? And again, another reason is representation. Seeing people who look like you. Honorable Naledi Chirwa was here. She opened for us. And I'm sure that seeing for a lot of young girls, also because I grew up in the same community as Naledi, I've been to the same church, same university, seeing her in those roles allows representation for me. And it also then allows involvement for myself and other young people. I think a lot of young people have chosen to just be like, you know, maybe this is just something for the elders. Let's just keep ourselves to Twitter wars, Instagram and whatever. But seeing young people enter these spaces shows that it is as much a duty for us as it is for everyone else. Because at the end of the day, Agenda 2063 is not going to be achieved in 2 years or 3 or 5. And the people who are currently driving it might not be there to see the end of it. That's why it's important to make sure that the youth are involved in policy driving, in pushing this thing, in educating others. Because at the end of the day, we will be the ones who will have to step up, take on the baton, and make sure that this baton is delivered to the year, the destination, and the ideal Africa that we all hope for. Another thing is, I think this is the most pertinent reason why young people should be in these spaces, why young people should be in leadership. Nothing is as black and white as it used to be, especially when we look at development, job prospects. People are able to find money in ways that people could have never imagined. And I'd like to argue in ways that we cannot teach the elders. We ourselves would have to run the forefront for these things. Nowadays, we find people who make money through social media influencing. Many can argue that it might not be like a whole lot of money, but it's enough money to consider it a job. It's enough money to send money home. It's enough money to take your cousins to school. It's enough money to pay for your rent. That's not a conventional career path. And I don't think we could try and teach our elders about drafting policies around making sure how best do we capacitate as many young people to go into influencing, to go into e-commerce. This is something we'd have to do for ourselves. Another thing is events. The previous colleague spoke about how Africa is more of a consuming continent, if I can say. We consume more. And we've seen with, for example, in Pretoria, there is a company called Homecoming Events. And all they do is host events. That's what they specialize in. They make parties, they host events. But through that, they've managed to create, I'm definitely sure, over 12 job opportunities for people. You see, so it's things that we could never think about or that our elders can't think about. But because they're working for other people, it's important that we don't sleep on it and we capitalize on it and make sure that we try and include as many people as possible. Another thing, this might not be a big aspect, but I think it's quite important, and I've seen it in my life as well. We as young people are a well of information for our elders. I say this in regards to, as I've said, most of us are first generational graduates, first time going to school. I was a history major, and I'm very passionate about matters regarding mental health. Black communities don't necessarily know about these things. Sorry about that. Black communities don't necessarily know about these things, but I believe that we as the young people can teach our elders through what we learn. So it's not just important to put us in leadership, but to also teach us so that we can go and teach our elders who, quite frankly, are still quite the shape shifters of culture. Whenever there is a rape in the family, the elders sit and the elders deliberate on what measures are they going to take. So it's important that our elders know that this is a matter that should not be brushed under the carpet. It is not just how men act, it's a violation to a child. It's going to scar the child in terms of trauma for many years to come. And they can only learn of these things through us. Mental health is also a rising, it's not a rising issue, but it's been there, but I think it's getting the recognition it deserves right now. And I've learned with my grandmother that they believe that you're crazy because you're bewitched and not because your mind is an actual organ. It's the most vital organ in your body. It controls every other thing. So if you're not well, every other aspect of your body, every other functioning is probably also not going to be well. So by me then saying and sharing with her through that, she's been able to then also then speak to her friends and be more diligent when it comes to how she contributes to other people's mental health. And the last aspect that I have here, the best thing about inclusion, including young people, is that we don't fear accountability. Even if you fear accountability, social media would not let us. You would be dragged to filth on Twitter platforms or whatever. And that is something our older leaders do not have, people to keep them accountable. Their peers fear them, and it shows in their actions. It shows in how they are able to get away with a lot of things. And that's an aspect that young people, or privilege that young people do not have. And those are my reasons and my sentiments why I believe young people should be included in leadership in the African dispensation and diaspora. And also this echoes aspect number 6 of the Agenda 2063. And yeah, that is my sentiments for today's discussion.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maseko. Hopefully none of us in this platform are dragged for filth for whatever utterances we do make. The point of this discussion, as I said earlier, is that it's a starting point for further discussions that will emanate from this point onwards. And that we hope that as we start this conversation, we can start to concretize some of our key priorities as young people that we'd like to address directly with Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, and other institutions that aim to sort of build a cohesive, economically, socially, and otherwise a continent as we engage, right? So I'll just go through partially some of the comments. I won't go through all of them that I've been able to pick up, and then we'll go through a sort of short Q&A with the panelists, and we'll try and take it from there. So one comment that I saw from Victoria Balogun is, personally, she finds it very offensive or oppressive when leadership around Africa says things like calling youths the leaders of tomorrow. This must stop. Does tomorrow ever come? Why can't they be leaders for this current day? If such is pushed for, then reps can't be staying in offices till the age of 70 or 80, yet having nothing to contribute. Look at the Nigerian National Assembly. Youth should be engaged and allowed to grow and lead better than they do now. We also have a comment from, or rather a question from Liberty. Liberty says, young people should get involved. How do we suggest that they do so? The old folks in positions have clogged leadership space. I think some of those comments have been addressed already. Makosi Ndebele says we need to lead now as young people so that we are empowered to pass on the baton to the upcoming youths of tomorrow. Our leaders are blinded by the fallacy of tomorrow, the very essence that hinders progressiveness and action in the present. Very well spoken there as well. And then you have Karen saying, as Kenyan youths, we should be able to stand up and reject the overhaul of a constitution that doesn't prioritize youth, women, and the disabled. And then, of course, one final one. Let's remember, from Io Wallace, let's remember these leaders have been trained and educated by colonial standards. The ageism relates to white supremacy because it's an issue of mentality and taking on Western frameworks in terms of governance without innovating our own structures and make sense to African societies. So I'll just end it there in terms of the comments for now, but I'll be going back should we have more questions out there. But let's start here with the idea of innovation, young people being able to be in a space where they can start to rethink the way in which governance itself takes place. So governance not only in the political space, but also governance in the corporate space. We heard from Ade speaking about the NSAS movement. We also know that Nigeria spearheaded this idea of not too young to run, where they had a whole campaign to ensure that the constitution enables a threshold for presidential elections to be lowered in order to enable young people to access that space. We also, from a South African perspective, also saw the Fees Must Fall movement that Ngobeko was talking about just now, which is all about young people participating actively outside of sort of the formal governance space, but will ultimately lead to a policy change and policy reform. So when we look at the nature of the different waves of young people's activism, we also saw that to some extent that some of the costs are the criminalization of young people, right? So Ngobeko was talking about this insofar as Ukanya, for instance, where activists who are doing work towards changing and shifting social norms and legal norms towards the advancements of young people's engagement, were criminalized by the systems that govern us right now. We still haven't seen or heard from our political leadership about either those young people being sort of forgiven legally for the things that they did in the interest of pursuing that specific policy. So Kelebogile, for you, what do you think are the areas of innovation economically, in terms of trade, in terms of the ways in which our interests as young Africans can be fostered, both through the Pan-African Parliament, but also just through other regional bodies that are meant to further economic prosperity? We know of ECOWAS, we know of the SADC, for instance. So all of these regional organizations, there's very little active engagement with young people. So in my perspective, and I'm sure most of us on our panel, is that the absence of young people means that there's not very much innovation that's happening in those spaces. So what are your thoughts on this?
No, thank you so much for the question. And I think I want to just step back a little bit and speak to what some of our members have spoken about in the comment section to say, how do we get involved? And I think the issue here isn't that young people are not getting involved. We are getting involved. The issue really is that we're not being recognized for the efforts that we are putting in. And the platforms haven't necessarily been created enough for us to showcase what we are doing. Innovation is there. Oftentimes, whether it's the right time, whether we've got the right market, it tends to be the issue that we need to deal with. And I think in answering some of these questions that you've just asked now, it'll really help us move forward. So I think in answering your question, the first thing that I really want to note is that I want to give a case study of a gentleman in a township where he wanted to start a bakery, for example. But like most of us, he didn't have the startup capital. He didn't have rich parents. He didn't have friends that had, disposable income just to throw into his business. But he thought very innovatively about it to say, what do I need the money to do for me? And so in so doing, he was able to then answer that question and think about different ways in which he could address this. So he thought to himself, what do I need? I need equipment, I need ingredients, I need all these other stuff. Who can I speak to assist me with this? So he went to a local bakery store and he said, listen, I have this idea. I'm good with what I do with my hands. However, I don't have the resources right now to start. Can I use your premises? I noticed that you open at 5 o'clock in the morning and you close at 5 p.m. in the afternoon. I'll come in at 5:30 in the evening, in the afternoon, and use your facilities. And by the time 5 o'clock in the morning comes, I'm done. I've cleaned your kitchen and I'm out, and I'm using my bicycle to go to door-to-door deliveries. And that's the kind of innovation that we really need to foster and make sure that places such as the Pan-African Parliament recognizes and celebrates on platforms such as this, but also in ways that really showcase to other young people that the innovative work that we do really has huge benefits and impact to the economies that we are a part of. The second element is around how we can get involved. I think I alluded to it when I spoke to the millennial boards, when we spoke about Unilever and Deloitte in my opening remarks. But this is something that is quite pertinent that we need to see all across different institutions, different bodies such as the Pan-African Parliament to say, can we perhaps start introducing elements around quotas for young people, much the same that we do have for women that have seats in particular boards or seats in Parliament and so forth. Can we then advocate for a space for young people, and we have a quota for this, to say, come in, help us think through these strategies that we want to implement. Tell us what the issues that you guys are going through right now, and come up with solutions that can really drive our continent to the light that we need to see it. And I think it was Mubeko who spoke about this to say, when we're speaking about Agenda 2063, we think about it as though it's so far away, but we need people that can get involved now that will help see it through to those times, and getting people that are young to get involved will help with elements such as that. And I think the last thing around how do we get involved and how do we work with the regional communities, economic communities, is to say we need them to be visible. We need them to be on all platforms that we have. Social media is not enough. We know today that only a handful of society actually has the means and has the infrastructure, has the devices to go onto a platform such as Zoom, such as YouTube, such as Instagram, to get information and knowledge. And we need to think about different ways that we can reach them. How do they get information? Do we then need to get ourselves to use radio more? Do we need to be able to go back to print media and be able to distribute that? So, we really do need to think about ways to make it visible, conversations such as this, in different platforms, and package it in such a way that allows people to be included in conversations such as this, and in order for us to move forward. And the last part that I want to speak to is that we should never, ever forget the importance of having hope and confidence. And I think when we speak about contributing towards the economy and moving forward in situations like this, we need to remember who we are as Africans, and understand that the vision that we want to drive is the Africa we really want to see. And in so doing, we really need to be confident in that mandate. We really need to instill hope, not just in the people that are around this conversation today, but to every single African, understanding that we need one another in order for us to grow as a continent and be the powerhouse that we really are.
Thank you very much, Kelebogela. Those were very useful inputs. Perminis, if you will recall, part of Ade's presentation spoke to the idea of firstly embracing ourselves as Africans first, the idea that we all ought to commit to this idea of an African identity, that we are all Africans, regardless of which sort of space in the continent that we occupy. And you, as a Kenyan working outside of Kenya, you would likely have been like aware of certain things that are happening in different spaces, specifically in South Africa at the moment that we're engaging and there is a spate of attacks in the trucking industry that seem to be quite Afrophobic in nature, quite xenophobic in nature, and we have had in the past couple of years some element of xenophobia cropping up sort of at every 5 years or something of that nature. And it seems that to the extent that every time we experience as South Africans, and to some respect, some economic downturn, some economic impact, the easiest targets does become our own African development. But when we talk about this idea of Pan-Africanism, engaging in Pan-African Parliament, uniting the whole of the African continent towards common and key strategic goals, there's still some work that ought to happen around building social cohesion. As a researcher and as someone who's engaged in the work of social cohesion, what would be maybe some of your key priorities in addressing that element of social cohesion? Because I do know that some of your work also engaged with township dwellers who own businesses to have some sort of conversation with the foreign nationals who might be residing in that area and also own businesses. So what would be your thoughts around sort of building an identity of Africanism in the way that we imagine it? You're currently on mute, Chip.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you all once again and to greet you in my home language, Swahili, habari zenu. I'm greeting you in Swahili because I believe Swahili is the most spoken language in Africa. It accounts from the East African region all the way through to the Central African region and parts of the Southern African region. So Swahili as a language, I believe, can be used to bring Africans together. And I believe there's some initiatives that are still on the grassroots and on the academic spheres that are being, channeled in through research and also in the grassroots to help unite Africans using one language. I know it's not something that can happen in one day or overnight. This is something that can create momentum with time. Yeah. So based on your question, and I will approach it using my experience as a researcher and the research that I conducted recently with the A2Pay company. Well, when it comes to issues of Afrophobia and xenophobia in South Africa, particularly speaking about shop owners, tuck shop owners, we call them spaza shop owners, because that is where most shops are attacked, because they are particularly based on, specifically based in the townships. Foreigners, we call them foreigners, but I don't call them foreigners, I call them African migrants. African migrants in South Africa, those that have based their skills on operating small shops, entrepreneurial shops. They base them in the townships in South Africa, across the country. And whenever violence, any form of violence starts, those are the main targets, because whoever is channeling the violence is mainly targeting shops so that they can loot them and then burn whatever is left so that they can scare whoever else wants to start a business such as that, so that they can allow South Africans to open their own shops. Because South Africans complain, especially the spaza shop owners community or associations, because they have their own associations, they're very much organized. They complain that there is too much competition coming from the African migrants' own tuck shops. This is so because African migrants, they develop a certain skill set of operating spaza shops in such a way that even their goods, whenever you go to buy their goods, they're a little bit cheaper than other shops. So now even the locals do not buy from their own locals. The locals prefer to buy from the African migrant shops. So this creates a lot of tensions and a lot of jealousy. Now, it is through this that some of the times you hear that there's a spark of violence happening in certain township, and then after a short while it comes down. But even after it comes down, what many people do not understand is one person or a couple of entrepreneurs, African migrant entrepreneurs, have been affected because their shops they've been looted and they're left without nothing, and probably even kicked out of the same township and gone to settle down somewhere else for safety purposes. So during my research, and it was also during this COVID period, so it was very sensitive time. So you could find most spaza shops, they're also, compliant to these COVID rules. Whenever you go to a spaza shop, you find they have a large plastic covering the entrance, and they just left a small space where you can give the money, and then they're gonna open and give you the goods that you're intending to purchase. So now during the research, we were conducting in conjunction with A2Pay company, and they were supplying vending machines. The vending machines' purposes was to bring in a new form of independence, and a new form of challenge. Let me say just a competitive advantage. The A2Pay company is proudly South African, and so it was only supporting South African spaza shop owners, and they were not supporting African migrant shops. So these particular vending machines were installed in South African owned spaza shops, and they were providing services such as selling airtime, selling DSTV, selling electricity, selling Hollywood bets and the lottery and so many other services. So all of a sudden now, because before the vending machines were installed, because the vending machines, they did not need any electricity. So even the remote shops that were deep inside the townships, that the areas that didn't have electricity, the vending machine could still operate because all you needed was a battery. So the A2Pay company installed the battery for the spaza shop owners, and then previously the locals used to travel all the way from the townships to the CBD, to the city, to buy electricity, to pay for the electricity, to pay for the DSTV, to buy airtime. But now, ever since these vending machines was installed, all of this changed so many things. They benefited the locals in such a way, in such a big way. So now the purpose of the whole research was to also combat xenophobic tensions that was happening previously and also currently, because now the South African owned tuck shops were in a competitive advantage position to compete now with the African migrant owned shops. And now, once now all of a sudden now you could sense now there is a sense of relief. So now our job as a research team was to collect data using questionnaires and finding out how the vending machines has affected their lives. Has it increased their income? Has it brought a sense of relief, you know, when it comes to the tensions that they have with the African migrant on tuck shops? And the response was very positive. So I came to realize that xenophobia, there's so many angles of looking at it. It's not something that is only instigated by political purposes. It's also something that, you know, is propelled by poverty, yeah, and by entrepreneur, you know, skills and lack of entrepreneurial skills on the ground, on the grassroots level. So now, if we have more companies such as A2Pay on the ground, working with the people on the ground, it can really do a lot of good. And because now, all of a sudden, now you will find out that some South Africans that didn't have the urge to own a tuck shop, they now come into the game, they come into the picture, and they also want to own a tuck shop because now they have a support system. Yeah. So
thank you so much, Priminis.
So,
in the interest of time, I'm sorry to just cut you there. But yeah, you mentioned quite a few things about the instance of sort of xenophobia not emerging from an innate sort of disdain for for foreign migrants. It's just a case of that there are other sort of key areas of development that haven't been addressed by our governments, and sort of the easy targets end up being our foreign brothers. And it's important to start to educate each other about the nature and patterns of migration and why these things happen. But moreover, we hope that in some respects that we can be more embracing of people from other environments, embracing of people with other linguistic and cultural differences to our own. Now, I'd like to move on to Unqubeko for just your sort of thoughts around this idea that when you spoke about quite clearly about an intentional purposive engagement with young people that ought to be had towards sustaining and achieving Agenda 2063. Earlier, we heard a comment from that Priminis had read from the chats that spoke to that we are either scared or that older people themselves are asking us don't want to engage with young people in a meaningful way because of the cultural sort of sentiments that are so pervasive in our continent. So the idea that you don't speak to the elders in a particular way, or you don't engage in a particular way because that's disrespectful. And just saying that, for instance, itself is an attempt at silencing the voice and the cries of young people wherever they may be. What are your thoughts around the intergenerational dialogue that ought to happen in order to facilitate a transfer of knowledge, a transfer of value, but also the idea that that transfer, as you did speak about earlier, it's not just one directional, but that it's about young people transferring their own values and thoughts as well, but also the elders themselves saying, we want to give you the opportunity to then express yourself in a real sort of way. What are your thoughts around that question?
Right. As I've mentioned, I really believe that it starts, this sounds so cliche, but it starts at home, really. These people who are in parliament, who are in leadership positions, they are parents to young people, I'd like to believe most of them. And by already having them circle around the idea of including young voices, that's a step. I think also being unapologetic, if it means that we shut down things, oh well, you know. But I think also one of the means that we've seen is social media. I'd like to believe most of those strategies, if not all, for COVID that we've seen is definitely from young people through Twitter. It would literally mimic what people would be saying on Twitter, on social media. And I'd like to believe that our ministers for years, it's actually the same minister they just shuffle around. For years, if they haven't been able to come up with these things, what is the difference now? I believe also these task forces that they've been able to come up with, particularly the Minister of Higher Education, Honorable Blade Nzimande, and including young people in these task teams. Those are some of the things that we can do. But it seems as though right now, the ball is not in our court. It's not for us to decide, but it's for the people who are in power, the older people to decide. And I think it's through agencies, it's through centers, it's through institutions such as yourself as Center for Human Rights to allow us to create opportunities where we can collaborate with government, we can collaborate with high-level officials to change certain things, to have our hand in drafting policies, to expose us to these people. I've seen with my experience with UNASA, we had an event last year for UN Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. And with that event, it was the Dutch Embassy or the Kingdom of the Netherlands, and in collaboration with UNASA UP and also DERCO. And what we then saw is the Dutch Embassy or the Netherlands, they were exiting the Security Council and South Africa was entering. And what we then saw is South Africa, within a month after the event or 2 months, they drafted the UN Resolution 1325 as an action plan. So those are the type of things that we were able to see with our eyes as the youth of the impact that we have managed to have on policies and legislative level type of matters. And because of that and our exposure to diplomats and ambassadors, some of us have been able to collaborate with them on events around certain things, primarily because the focus last year was on women, primarily on women's issues. We've managed to work with diplomats who, I believe by working with them, you change how they see things. And I believe those are the key aspects that we can try. So just to summarize everything I've said, us as the youth, speaking to our parents at home because they go into these workspaces. And then also resistance, as we've always been doing. And then again, institutions and corporations and centers also then giving young people platforms to link them or to link us as young people with people in government.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maseko, for that contribution. Now going to Ade, just for the final thoughts from the panel itself. Before I address Ade, there's a comment from Nonhlanhla Ado Bakasa, who says, what bothers me most is that people making decisions in leadership right now will not have to live with the consequences and effects of those decisions tomorrow. It is us, the youth, that will have to pay for all of the decisions that they've taken. How is it then that we are not majority stakeholders in decision making? Why are our voices not amplified in policy making? Furthermore, as youth, we need, my apologies, we need, as youth, we need to make sure that we strongly advocate for full inclusion in parliaments. This includes persons with disabilities. Young people with disabilities need to have representation in leadership as well, so that they cannot be forgotten as they usually are when decisions are being made and solutions are brought about it. She speaks for the National Council for persons with disabilities in South Africa. And she echoes her thanks to the opening speaker, Naledi, Honorable Naledi Chirwa. So Ade, in respect to some of your thoughts earlier, you did speak about the idea that, for instance, the youth ministries themselves being represented by people beyond the youth age. The idea that establishing a set of best practices is something that we also need to try and get a rally around. Our current leaders themselves emerged as young people, but have stuck around for patronage and to some extent access to the economy. And in respect to the NSARS movement, we spoke about that idea that it is a movement that's been birthed, that people don't seem to recognize it or see it, but there's work that's being done in order to cement the gains. So as part of that discussion is, how do we sustain the political activism that happens for young people and about young people in various spaces in various countries, but how do we also make it a cross-continent initiative, that when you talk about NSARS, that we're not just retweeting, but that we're actually engaging into diplomatic channels of our country, because we know that these guys talk to one another. The presidents talk to one another, the ministers talk to one another. We have delegations residing in different spaces just for the purposes of diplomacy. How do we ensure that we start to adopt some of these measures as sustainability mechanisms for the work that starts on the ground in the various countries that we reside in?
Thank you very much. I think that's quite germane, because we often tend to also ask ourselves, beyond agonizing, what do we do? Because we can't keep talking about the problems and the problems. There have to be ways that we want to also address them. And that's why I think I like what we are doing more beyond anything else. So it's quite important to note, first of all, that our governments, respective governments now across this continent, as much as it looks always like they don't have a sense of shame, truth is they don't also like to be externally embarrassed or disgraced or called out. So, and that's one thing we have to realize. In fact, more than ever, this movement and everything that has come afterwards has made us realize that. So, talking about how do we organize and sustain to ensure that this movement goes beyond, it now becomes what is now really political, and it becomes the center stage for all of us to come together, either as African countries or as young people across the continent, to mobilize and ensure that we have a better continent for ourselves. So I would say, number one, we have to count our blessings. For every generation, there is a unique tool. So we wouldn't say that our mothers before us haven't done things, or some of our fathers haven't done things. It's just now the realities are different. We are the young people now. We have other tools that are available to us now that were not necessarily available at those points. So one of them for me would be real-time technology. How were we able to organize ourselves, even to the point of having comrades, of having solidarity across the continent and across the globe as well? So we did that, real-time technology, because we know that some of these people, and probably some of you have seen the ridiculous thing that came after in Nigeria. The immediate move that the government wanted to make was to sponsor this social media regulation bill, and then just to say, we want to be able to control what the young people say and how they say it and so on. So that's just one, to count our blessings and to leverage, the gains, the tools that are available to our generation. So one of the things we have come to realize is that this, whatever we need to do after now, which is starting now, has to be multidimensional. So as some of us are holding down the political front to say, look, we don't want, when you're not going to engage us by talking at us and say, okay, young people, this is what we think you should now do. This is what, no, please. We are going to engage in a conversation by talking with you. You won't talk at us. That has gone on for years. So what are we immediately doing? We are educating. See, education is totally primary and germane. And we realize now, as we have moved on, that even among us young people, the level of, and when I say education, yes, formal education, definitely, but then even the informal understanding of the spaces and what is going on. So we realize that there's also a bridge, there's a divide. So an average young person in the municipal area or the urban center, for instance, is also fundamentally different at the level of education from a young person in the grassroots in some areas that are in the suburbs. So that's also, we realize that we have to carry along every class of young person, you know, in letting them understand what is currently at stake and what the issues are about. So nobody is useless. I am not better than my fellow young person in the suburbs because I've had the privilege of going to school somewhere. No, there's something he can bring to the table or she can bring to the table, which is even native intelligence, native understanding of issues. So we have to ensure that it's a collective thing. It's not for those of us who have gone to school. It's also for those of them who haven't had this privilege that we have had, you know, and so on. So that's for the political movement, going to the grassroots to ensure that as some of us are holding it down with technology, with social media, with new media, some of us are also still doing the work on the ground, because some of us are closer to the grassroots than the rest. So we have to hold it down on the ground. Then one of the things that we have to keep doing, or we have to even do more now, is to hold down as well the economic space. So we have another advantage of innovation, of creativity with our generation. And that's why you will see that a lot of young people in Africa, when they go to the diaspora, when they go out of these shows, they excel massively. And then you find our ridiculous people in government sometimes coming back to say, oh, we're proud of our daughter who has just made it to the UK Parliament, or we're proud. And we've started calling them out, like, come on, stop it. Those of us who are at home, what have you done with us? If they were here, would you have given them that opportunity? So, you know, they have this idea of praising and celebrating those that are excelling outside, not realizing that they are the reason most times that those inside are not even excelling. So what we are doing is to hold it down at the economic front to ensure that we still keep making resources to be able to sustain our movement. So the truth of the matter is that we will not have the same economic status or social status. Some of us might have it better than the rest, or others might have it better than some. But truth of the matter is, I might have the resources financially, I might not be called politically to lead things. So we have to interconnect and see where the linkages come. So if, for instance, Kelebogile is more, let's say, intellectually empowered than myself, but I've been able to hold it down economically, I can sponsor her. You know, and this cuts across the continent. We have to start spotting our brilliant minds and good enough. We have technology. Why am I on this program today? I am in Nigeria. This thing is going on practically in South Africa. All of us are here from all over the continent. It's because we have real-time technology. So we can interconnect in that way. Bring the resource you have to the table, and I bring mine. Then I think the last thing are basically just our regional bodies. See, I love to say it as it is. Our regional bodies have failed us so far. And with this movement, I think I've even learned that more. Now, something happened in 2019, just last year. We found ourselves, you know, we're working together on ideas and blah, blah. It was young global changers and everything. And then we were in Berlin. And somebody who, I would cover their shame by not mentioning the name of that regional body right now. So the representative of that regional body was on stage with representatives of the Chinese government and some other, you know, governments of everywhere. Already, I even had a problem with that forum because it was called, the relation between China and Africa. And I had my issue with that. Africa is a continent, for God's sake. China is a country. So for the part, look, we understand our similarities. We as Africans, we are harnessing, but you can't keep relating to us as though we are those people, just another piece of people that you use when you need and then you discard, you know, and so on. And then our representative was saying certain things that I was so irritated. You know, he said things like, oh, you know, we know China is always willing to help us and we are willing to, and I said, no, cut it. Africa right now, we know everybody is after the soul of Africa. Africa has not just potentials, we have real things, we have resources. So we should start negotiating as if we have the real power, because we do. So when we negotiate like beggars, it also makes us to be in a disadvantaged position. But this generation, more than ever, has realized that, look, we have the real resources. We have the real power. Everybody is dragging to come to Africa. Why is everybody after Africa? It's because you have something to give. People don't throw stones at trees that don't have fruits. It's when you have fruits as a tree that everybody is trying to pluck and everything. So that was what I made him realize. So I now realize that right now, we have to also put our regional bodies to the task. What do I mean? When we were in Berlin, when that happened, you know what we did? We immediately started organizing as young Africans right there. And we said, look, let's create an agenda. It's bad enough. G8, we're not part of it. G7, we're not part of it. G20, okay, like South Africa is leading the way in some places. And we're like, okay, we are grateful. But you know what we did? Because we saw the agenda, we have observer positions in those meetings and so on. But we realized that even those things that our governments or our representative ageist leaders go there to present, they don't even represent the realities of the young Africans, you know. So what we did was to come together as young Africans to say, look, we need to make our own agenda happen. And we did that right there, and we sent it along. And this was where we now use the power of interconnectedness again, because we have people who are also young people in those bodies or within those bodies who are willing, who are eager, who are just waiting, like, just bring us something, let's push it, bring us something. And we did that, and we pushed that agenda through them. And that was how our voice was heard. Just our realities were also brought to the limelight through that. I don't want to talk too much. I think I'm already doing that. So I'll just pause it.
Cool. Thank you so much, Ade, for that input. I think those were very clear steps about how we could potentially leverage on each other's potential, on each other's lived experiences, on the various resources that we try to engage with as we increase our activism, increase our visibility in very different policy making spaces. And of course, this engagement was held as a partnership between the Democracy Development Program led, the engagement itself was led by the Center for Human Rights, and which is based at the University of Pretoria. And these are some of the things that, as civil society organizations as well, that we need to also leverage off each other's capacity to be able to conduct certain things, that when we do work at various levels, that we reach out to one another, and we say that these are the things that we are possibly that are achievable with the different partnerships that we engage in towards advancing the voice both of young people, but the African continent as a whole, in ensuring that we reach a level of engagement and participation that we think is fair and representative of all citizens across the continent. So once again, I want to mention that this is a starting point for the conversations that we hope to have. Bonolo and myself will be working quite closely over the next year to ensure that we establish a Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus coalition that will enable more conversations of this nature, some of them quite pointed and targeted towards the plenary sessions of the Pan-African Youth Parliament plenary sessions. So Bonolo and the Center for Human Rights will be in touch in relation to the way forward as we start to prepare for the Pan-African Parliament 2021 plenary sessions. And we do hope that you were able to engage and gain as much as possible. We do apologize that we weren't able to go through all of the comments and questions, but the recording of this engagement, I'm sure, will be available via the Center for Human Rights for anyone to either rewatch or to share with other constituencies that were not in the room. It's very important that conversations that we have in spaces like these, we do take them to some of our other constituencies that don't have the capacity, for instance, to engage on platforms like this. We'd like to thank the Pan-African Parliament Youth Caucus representative that told us at the beginning. We'd also like to thank Honorable Naledi Chirwa for that very engaging opening speech for the platform that we're able to have. We'd also like to thank our four panelists for the insights and their willingness to participate in spaces like this. Ngobeko Maseko, Aderonke Ige, Kenelogile, and Perminis for engaging us as we have. And we look forward to future engagements. And we hope that 2020 ends well or better than it has been for the past couple of months, and that we have a 2021 as a continent as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you everyone. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thank you very much, Pamela. Thank you everyone. Bye-bye.